There was a night when the sea didn't behave like the sea. The waves didn't breathe in the earth's usual rhythm. They rose up like living walls, heavy and violent, as if something colossal was pushing the ocean from beneath the very crust of the world. Fishermen who had known those waters since childhood later said the sound was different. It wasn't just the roar of the wind, it was a deep, low sound, almost like thunder trapped inside the ocean. The animals sensed it first. Entire schools of fish vanished from the coastal regions. Dolphins completely abandoned the coves. Even the seabirds used to storms flew far inland as if fleeing from something humans couldn't see yet. Then the entire horizon began to change. Where there had only been dark, distant water before, a liquid wall began to rise, too vast to be called a wave. It was a mass movement, slow and inevitable, as if the planet itself were tilting the sea against the land. In the coastal cities, lanterns started lighting up in the windows. People didn't know exactly what was happening, but human instinct recognizes an omen before it understands the explanation. High above those turbulent waters, in the heights of Olympus, a few gods watched in silence. They knew what mortals did not. This was not just a storm. The ocean was responding to a will, an ancient, powerful, and unpredictable will. The will of a god whose mood could turn calm into catastrophe. At that moment, the Trident had been raised. And when Poseidon's trident touched the world, the earth shook, the mountains trembled, and the sea became a weapon. Something had provoked the Lord of the Oceans, something so serious that even the gods began to fear the consequences. Because that night, as the sea rose like a living wall before humanity, a silent question echoed through Olympus. What if this time Poseidon didn't stop? Long before maps outlined the contours of the planet, humans already knew one thing. The sea was not just water. It had moods, it had silence, and sometimes it had anger. In the distant past, ancient civilizations looked out at the vast and mysterious dark horizon and understood something we've all too easily forgotten in our modern world today. The waves weren't just simple movement, they were profound signs, messages from a powerful force that existed long before cities, ships, and the very first written stories ever recorded. For the Greeks, this force had a name spoken with respect, sometimes with fear, and almost always with caution: Poseidon. He didn't just rule the seas. He ruled over earthquakes that split mountains, storms that wiped out entire fleets, and deep currents that no mortal ever managed to control. Unlike other gods of Olympus, Poseidon didn't need to raise his voice to be feared. All it took was a gesture, just the silent weight of his trident touching the ground of the world. And there was a moment, a single moment, when that gesture almost changed everything. An instant when the wrath of the god of the ocean came dangerously close to something not even the gods themselves wished to witness. Today you're going to hear this story, not as a distant legend, but as a dark episode of mythology, where pride, vengeance, and divine power came together over the deepest waters on the planet. But before we continue this journey through the shadows of Olympus, leave your mark here. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and help this story reach more people who are also fascinated by the mysteries of mythology. And I'm curious about something. Which city and state are you watching this video from? Write it in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. Now get ready, because to understand the day Poseidon almost destroyed the world, we need to go back to the moment when someone made the mistake of challenging the Lord of the Oceans. On the shores of the ancient world, there was a city that faced the sea. Its walls were tall, its streets bustling with trade, and its ports never slept. Ships came and went like the steady breaths of a giant creature. For its inhabitants, the ocean wasn't a mystery, it was their livelihood, their road, their wealth. And slowly, it became something even more dangerous, something they believed they could control. For years, the fishermen of that ancient coastal city had braved storms, crossed treacherous currents, and returned with harrowing tales of the most turbulent and unpredictable seas. Each successful journey fed a quiet belief among mortals. Maybe the gods weren't so necessary after all. Maybe the ocean could be mastered with skill, courage, and sturdy ships. Of all the men in that city, none was more admired than the king. He was young, ambitious, and had the dangerous confidence of someone who had never been defeated. His ships were the largest in the region. His fleet sailed through seas that other sailors avoided, and with every new victory, his reputation spread like wildfire across a dry field. One night, during a grand banquet in the palace hall, wine flowed freely among the guests. The tables were loaded with fresh fish, warm bread, and exaggerated tales of sea voyages. It was there, among laughter and raised glasses, that the king spoke the words that would change everyone's fate. He said that no god ruled over the sea. He said that the vast and unpredictable ocean obeyed only the courage of the men who boldly dared to face it. Some guests laughed, while others fell silent, because every single person there knew there was a specific name you shouldn't provoke when it came to the sea, the name of Poseidon. But the king didn't stop. He raised his cup in front of everyone and declared that his ships had conquered more seas than any deity. That it was his own hands, not the trident of some invisible god, that were responsible for the wealth arriving at the ports. Some fishermen lowered their eyes at that moment. Men who had spent their lives gazing at the horizon knew how to recognize when human pride started to cross a dangerous line. 'Cause the sea listens. It always listens. The wind carries words to places men can't even imagine. And far from there, in the depths where sunlight never reached, something ancient heard every one of those words and began to awaken. In the regions where the ocean turns black and the silence weighs like stone, there's a kind of stillness that doesn't belong to the human world. There, the light disappears just a few meters below the surface, and the water becomes an ancient, vast, and indifferent realm. It was in this abyss that the mortals affront finally found ears. Poseidon didn't need messengers. The waters were his extension. Every current, every tide, and every vibration of the ocean carried fragments of the world to him. Human words, thrown to the wind with arrogance, traveled across the restless surfaces and slowly descended to the depths where the god rested. That night, when the king's proclamation crossed the open sea, something changed. It wasn't an abrupt movement, nor a visible gesture. It was subtler than that, like the first tremor of a mountain before it collapses. The god of the seas opened his eyes. The ancients used to say that when Poseidon awoke from his stillness, the entire ocean could feel it. Not because he shouted, but because his presence altered the balance of the world. The sea was not just water under his authority, it was a living organism that responded to its lord's mood. On the surface, the first signs began almost imperceptibly. Currents that had always flowed in one direction changed their course. Entire schools of fish vanished from their usual routes. Fishing nets came back empty to the ports. The oldest fishermen noticed first. Men with calloused hands, who had spent decades watching the sea's behavior, sensed something was wrong in the weight of the waves. They were no longer breathing in the ocean's natural rhythm. In the nights that followed, the wind began to blow irregularly. Sometimes violent gusts would appear without warning. Other times, the sea became too still, as calm as a deep lake. A silence that made even the most experienced sailors uneasy. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the ocean, Poseidon's trident rested on ancient rocks covered in dark coral. The god didn't need to raise his weapon yet. His growing irritation alone was enough to make the waters around him start to move. Because for a god like Poseidon, revenge wasn't about haste, it was about the tide. First it pulls back, Then it returns with enough force to swallow everything in its path. At first, the cities still didn't understand what was happening. The bustling city ports were still crowded, merchants were loudly shouting out their prices on the docks, and ships still set out toward the horizon exactly as they had done for generations. To most people, the vast ocean just seemed a little more restless than usual. But the older, more experienced fishermen didn't share that sense of calm. Men who had spent many decades watching the behavior of the waves began exchanging long, uneasy, and silent glances on the pier. They knew the sea had moods, and this particular mood was the kind that came before tragedies. The tides started to rise irregularly. On certain days, the water would surge several meters beyond the usual shoreline, swallowing up patches of sand and soaking the foundations of the city's first buildings. At other times, the ocean would recede too far, revealing rocks and sandbanks that were usually hidden. Ships began reporting strange occurrences during their voyages. Some sailors claimed to heard strange, low-frequency rumblings coming from the depths, as if something absolutely massive was moving beneath their vessels. Others swore they saw enormous, dark silhouettes gliding beneath the surface of the water. Even so, the king showed no concern. He stayed firmly convinced that the seas were intended exclusively for the most courageous of men. In his words, storms had always existed, and strong sailors had always known how to get through them. But that very same week, one of the largest ships in the fleet disappeared. There was no physical wreckage and no living survivors. The ship simply never returned. When the search boats sent to look for it finally returned days later, the crew members were pale and in an eerie silence. They had found only a broken piece of the mast floating on strangely restless waters. Meanwhile, in the unfathomable depths of the ocean, Poseidon walked among towering natural stone columns formed over millennia. Each step he took made the water around him vibrate with an almost imperceptible force. But it was enough to disturb currents that crossed half the world. The god of the seas was not as impulsive as mortals imagined. He watched, sensed, weighed every offense like someone measuring the strength of a tide before unleashing it against the shore. And in that moment, holding the trident that could split mountains and open the ocean floor, Poseidon finally made a decision. The very first massive storm suddenly arrived without any warning. The sky was still clear when the wind suddenly changed direction with force. Within minutes, the horizon vanished behind a wall of black clouds, advancing like a silent army. The sailors at the port felt the heaviness in the air even before the rain began to fall. It was a strange, suffocating pressure, as if the sky itself were descending onto the sea. Some ran to tie up their boats. Others just stood there, staring at the ocean, motionless, as if witnessing something inevitable. Then came the thunder. Not a quick crack in the sky, but a deep sound that seemed to be born from within the water. The sea began to churn in an unnatural way, waves rising in opposite directions, crashing into each other with brutal force. The rain fell soon after, heavy, dense, almost solid. Within minutes, the streets near the port turned into rivers. Lanterns were snuffed out by the wind, and the roar of the storm drowned out every other sound in the city. In the midst of all that chaos, a gigantic wave appeared on the horizon. This one was different from the others. It rose higher than any ship, a mass of dark water moving forward slowly, as if it was aware of its own weight. The oldest fisherman knew what that meant. No ordinary storm could create a wave of that magnitude. That was the extraordinary level of power the ancients attributed to only a single divine entity. In the depths of the ocean, Poseidon's trident finally moved. When the tip of the weapon touched the seafloor, a massive vibration rippled through the waters, spreading like a liquid earthquake. Underwater mountains trembled. Ancient currents were torn from their natural paths, and on the surface, the ocean responded like an army obeying the command of its king. Waves began to rise in succession, each one bigger than the last. Ships were lifted like fragile toys and hurled against the rocks. Masts snapped, sails tore, men vanished beneath the raging water. And as the sea surged onto the coast with growing force, a terrible truth began to dawn on everyone. Poseidon wasn't just angry. He was punishing. The storm didn't end that night. It grew stronger. For hours, the wind kept tearing through the sky, and the sea surged against the coast like a living creature, trying to reclaim something that belonged to it. People ran to the highest parts of the city, carrying children, lanterns, and whatever little they could hold on to. From the nearby hills, you could see the entire ocean in motion. It wasn't just a series of violent waves. It was as if the very surface of the world was being pushed forward, yard by yard, with a force impossible to contain. Mighty ships that once ruled the vast seas were now wrecked along the coast. Some were hurled against the jagged rocks, while others completely disappeared without a trace into the darkness of the raging, turbulent waters. The king's proud fleet, built over years, was being wiped out in a single night. Even inside the palace, the sound of the ocean was impossible to ignore. The king, who just days before had boasted in front of his guests, now watched the horizon through the open windows of the hall. Each thunderclap seemed like a direct response to his words, but the worst was yet to come. Out on the open sea, far beyond mortal sight, a gigantic mass of water began to rise. At first slowly, almost imperceptibly, then higher and higher, fueled by the power of Poseidon's Trident. This was no ordinary wave. It was a liquid wall, growing like a dark mountain in the middle of the ocean. Fish, debris, and entire currents were swept up into that colossal movement. High on Olympus, the ancient gods watched that moment with unease, because even among immortals there was an unspoken and sacred rule. Certain powers, when fully unleashed, could transform the entire world into something unrecognizable. The wave surged relentlessly toward the coast. With every second, it grew larger. Every meter it traveled increased the weight of millions of tons of water, driven by the will of a single god. And when that wall finally appeared on the horizon of the city lit by lightning, everyone understood the same thing at the same time. If Poseidon wished, that would be humanity's last night. In that moment, faced with the wall of water advancing like the end to all things, human pride was finally broken. The king who had challenged the sea fell to his knees before the furious horizon. There was no sword capable of cutting through a wave. There was no wall capable of stopping the ocean. For the first time, he understood the weight of his words. The ancients did not fear the sea out of superstition. They respected it because they knew that behind the waters there was a divine will. In the unseen depths of the world, Poseidon watched the result of his wrath, and in that silence between one thunderclap and the next, something changed. The wave kept advancing, but not with the final force that could have destroyed everything. At the last moment, as if an invisible tide had pulled the ocean back, the wall of water lost some of its fury. Still devastating, still able to destroy ports, ships, and entire houses, but not enough to wipe out humanity. The sea slowly receded, leaving behind a devastated coastline, broken ships, and a people who would never forget that night. From that day on, no one in that city ever spoke of the ocean with arrogance again, because they had seen something few mortals ever witness. The moment when a god almost decided to destroy the world and chose not to. And whenever the wind blows hard over the sea, some still wonder if the Lord of the Depths is merely sleeping or just waiting for mankind's next mistake.